Well, good afternoon, everyone, and welcome to today's event. I'm Eric Nestler. I'm director of the Friedman Brain Institute, and it gives me enormous pleasure to welcome you all to this first of 2021 Diverse Brains event. We launched Diverse Brains about 5.5 years ago to promote diversity and inclusion and optimal climate throughout the Friedman Brain Institute at Mount Sinai. And no topic is more at the heart of our original goals than today's topic on the impact of racism on mental health. I, for one, look forward very much to learning how we all might be perpetuating racism even without realizing it. I want to start by thanking today's moderators, Aya Osman, who's a postdoctoral fellow, and Joe Simon, who's a neuroscience graduate student within the Friedman Brain Institute, for organizing this exciting, important, and timely panel. Aya, I'll turn things over to you.
Good afternoon, everyone, and thank you, Dr. Nesler. Thank you, everyone, for joining us for our first session of the Impact of Racism on Mental Health series, presented to you by the Friedman Brain Institute, as well as the Office for Diversity and Inclusion here at Mount Sinai. As Dr. Nesler mentioned, my name is Aya Osman, a third-year SIVA Autism Center postdoctoral fellow in the Karali Lab, and my colleague Joe Simon, who's a fourth-year PhD student in Erin Rich Lab, will be moderating today's session. The aim behind this lecture series is twofold. Firstly, we aim to invite researchers studying various aspects of racism on mind and body, with the aim of amplifying their important work, making their findings more accessible to the public, and increasing collaborations with researchers here at Sinai. Secondly, as Dr. Nesler mentioned, we hope this lecture series will open our eyes to the ways racism can be perpetuated and spark dialogue around dismantling structural racism in the mental health field, as well as discuss ways to heal from its impacts. We would like to remind the audience that there will be a 10 to 15-minute discussion at the end of this session, where we will be taking questions from the audience. So please feel free to send your questions and comments in the Q&A box at any time during the presentations, and we will delve into these at the end of the session. Without further ado, it is my honor to present to you Dr. Tanya Jovanovic, who is a professor in the Department of Psychiatry and Behavioral Neuroscience and the David and Patricia Barron Chair of PTSD Neurobiology at Wayne State University. Dr. Jovanovic's research focuses on the interactions of traumatic experiences, neurophysiology, neuroendocrinology, and genetics in stress-related disorders in high-risk populations. She directs the Detroit Trauma Project, where a large focus of her work and central to the discussion today is the impact of urban trauma exposure on the brain and subsequent behavior. Her research employs psychological measures like heart rate variability, fear-potentiated startle response, and brain imaging methods to investigate biomarkers that could indicate risk of trauma-related psychopathology. We would like to thank Dr. Jovanovic for speaking with us today, and we look forward to her insights on the biological impacts of racism and the implications for negative outcomes. Dr. Jovanovic, over to you.
Thank you, and I want to thank Aya and Joe for organizing this session. I'm so excited and honored to be part of it. So I'm going to talk about some of the biological impacts of racism and really what the implications for negative health outcomes are. I'm going to present some data from the Grady Trauma Project at Emory University in Atlanta and some brand new data from the Detroit Trauma Project. So I moved from Emory to Wayne State about 1.5 years ago. So I want to really start out by acknowledging this large group effort. So the Detroit Trauma Project really is the lab at Wayne State University, and I'll show you in some of the upcoming slides some of the data that we've collected as part of this group over the summer. And that's really been collected largely in collaboration with the Neuroscience Center for Anxiety, Stress, and Trauma at Wayne State, led by Dr. Seth Norholm. And then our other collaborators, I want to mention Sierra Carter is an assistant professor at Georgia State University, and she was a postdoc at the Grady Trauma Project who really started to hone in this interest in focusing on discrimination and measures of racial discrimination in our population. The population at Grady Trauma Project is about 95% African American, and you'll see that we have also a very high proportion of African or Black American participants in our Detroit trauma population as well. And then a really critical component of this collaboration is Dr. Bale's lab from University of Maryland and Yasmin Cisse, who has really been developing the molecular methods that I'm going to show you some data on. So I have nothing to disclose. And I want to just briefly talk about the definition of racism and racial discrimination. This is really something that Monica is going to cover in more detail later. But just to give you a brief definition, it is the unjust or prejudicial treatment of different categories of people on the grounds of race. And we know that at least 90% of Black adults and youth as young as 8 report experiencing at least one incident of racial discrimination in the last year. And then discrimination types can be experienced in different ways, either in vivo or vicariously through others. We know that race-based trauma can lead to post-traumatic stress. And again, you'll hear more about that in Monica's talk. It can be both subjective or subjective, and some of the measures that we are going to report are really going to be the perception of discrimination. And then there also can be interpersonal or institutional or systematic racism. And this year in particular, in 2020, really racial discrimination has come to the forefront with the Black Lives Matter movement and all the violence that has happened this summer. I think this is a very timely topic to be thinking about and how this might impact people of color. And this summer, of course, we are also battling the COVID-19 pandemic. So that really puts Black Americans at an additional disadvantage. So not only is the pandemic disproportionately affecting minorities and especially Black Americans, but also we have this pervasive racism that, again, has been really in the forefront this summer. So, as I said, I moved to Detroit about 1.5 years ago, and pretty soon after moving, the pandemic started. And so what we really wanted to do was capture some data about how COVID-19 was affecting urban communities in Detroit. So we started collecting data remotely from May through December of this year. This was, again, data collected on the phone. So we had about almost 300 individuals with data collected, of which almost 200 are Black American, and then another 100 or so are mixed ancestry. I want to point out that the mixed ancestry group is kind of a combination of both European ancestry, but also in Southeast Detroit, we have a lot of immigrants from Middle Eastern countries, a lot of Indian ancestry as well. So it's truly more of a mixed group than a all Caucasian group. And so when we were collecting data, the first session, we did a phone call collecting information about COVID-19 related stressors. And during this session, we also had participants download an app to their phones that would collect data every day for 15 consecutive days. And we asked a lot of questions about their social interactions, both in person and remotely. But one of the questions we asked every day was to report on whether they had experienced discrimination that day. And then 3 months later, we did a follow-up assessment to capture any changes or whether there were any increases in PTSD symptoms and resilience using the CD-RISC. And again, this is in collaboration with the Neurocast Center at Wayne State University. So I wanted to show you this graph. This is really showing that daily reporting. So we started collecting data. We just happened to start collecting May 19th. And this is data showing you only reports in Black Americans. And you'll see that self-reported instances of experiences of discrimination are actually at 0 until May 25th. And that's when George Floyd was killed. And as that becomes known in the media, you see this very big increase in reports of discrimination. And it dips down a little bit later in June, and then it spikes up again as a lot of the protests start to happen. So I think this is really important to see how in real time you can see this major impact of racism in the media and how it really is impacting how people are perceiving discrimination. Because we don't believe that people were not discriminated against up until that day. It's just that their reports of discrimination then spike. And again, it becomes really in the forefront of their consciousness. So one of our students in the lab, Marwa Harp, really wanted to see whether governmental intervention on any level might also be associated with these rates of reported discrimination. So in the state of Michigan, Governor Whitmer made an executive directive on July 9th to really focus on equity in the healthcare system. And so Marwa looked at these reports before and after July 9th, and you do see on average a pretty big decrease in reporting. Again, this is day to day. All individuals who completed their daily reporting before July 9th and those after July 9th. And just to emphasize that this is just correlational data. We don't know whether in fact it was the news in the media that had this impact, but it was just an interesting observation that we made. And I also want to note that Marwa will be presenting this data at the Anxiety and Depression Association of America conference. Another piece of data I want to show you is from Karis Wiltshire in the lab, and she was really interested in comparing self-reported stress related to COVID-19 by actual incidence of the disease or the virus cases by zip code. So you see the Michigan mitten in the top corner, and you see that the rates of the virus infection was highest in the Detroit area and then in Grand Rapids. And so she mapped this according to zip code by our participants, and looking at the Black American and mixed ancestry, you'll see that the highest number of cases in Detroit are really coming from our Black American participants in the study. And then she also examined this reported stress related to COVID-19. And we asked questions about how stressed their community was. And you'll see that those same areas map on with, again, the Black American participants reporting a lot more community stress than our mixed ancestry participants. And then in this questionnaire that we asked, we really focused not just on mental health outcomes, but we also wanted to get some measures of just institutional effects of COVID-19 or instrumental barriers. So for example, we looked at housing, food insecurity, social isolation, household conflict, and mental health. And what emerged was really a different pattern by race. So on average, we did not see a race difference in reported stress scores, but the patterns were very different in that Black Americans were significantly reporting more stress related to housing and food insecurity, whereas our mixed ancestry participants were reporting more stress related to social isolation, household conflicts, and mental health concerns. We also found, and this is by William Davey, who's also going to be presenting his data at ADAA in the spring. If you look at the COVID-19 stress predicting PTSD symptoms 3 months later, again, in the two groups, we did not see overall differences. So there was a robust association with future PTSD in both Black American and mixed ancestry participants. However, we found that the patterns of individual items on these questions were very different. And so this heat map shows you the associations. I'll show you a little bit more detail in a second. But the brighter the colors in the warm regions, these are mapping of correlation R coefficients. So you'll see that these associations, so looking here at one's own physical health, not only is in the Black American population a stronger association with own mental health outcome, but also a significant negative association with resilience. And that's a pattern we do not see in the mixed ancestry group. So really we're seeing that the stress related to one's own physical health related to COVID-19 is predicting much less resilience 3 months later. And then another thing that we see is that past stressor, trauma, and anxiety or depression that are brought on by this COVID-19 stress is much higher, more predictive of PTSD symptoms than what we're seeing in our mixed ancestry group. So what we want to know is, are these racial differences related to neurobiology? And I want to just briefly mention this paper. Nate Hartnett, who is at McLean and Harvard, really looked at this study recently in an fMRI paradigm, and this was a threat-related functional neuroimaging paradigm. And I want to just show you these top figures. The first row is really showing greater activation in white Americans compared to Black Americans. The bottom row is the reverse contrast, where Black Americans are showing almost no greater activation than white Americans. And so there's really substantial blunting of activation related to threat. But when the model actually included negative life experiences as a covariate, you'll see this next row of data that I'm highlighting that really shows that the racial differences are much attenuated. They're not gone, but they are accounted for largely by these negative life experiences or adverse events, which include chronic stressors such as racial discrimination. And we do know that discrimination is associated with post-traumatic stress disorder. In fact, in our Detroit trauma project sample, we did see that only in the Black Americans, not in the mixed ancestry, we saw a relationship between discrimination and PTSD symptoms. So what we really need to know is, how do these stressors affect the brain? And how do we identify these biological mechanisms and biomarkers that we can then use to look at these impacts on mental health? And this is a very complicated diagram here, but we want to really understand how this top level of discrimination, emotional states, low SES, becomes biologically embedded so that we can see it at the cellular level. And one of the candidates that I'm going to talk about today is mitochondrial DNA damage, and how we might really then be able to measure this stress, again, in plasma. So cell-free circulating mitochondrial DNA was originally thought to be released in response to tissue injury or cellular stress. We see that it's increased in many diseases and disorders, but it's also increased in plasma of individuals with depression, as well as suicide attempters. So this plasma marker does seem to be related to some pretty complex mental health outcomes associated with chronic stress. So to better understand these mechanisms, Yasmin Cisse, again in Tracy's lab, Dr. Bale's lab, worked on an animal model of chronic stress. So how do you model racism in a mouse? So, to be clear, we can never model all the complexities of racism-related stress in a mouse, but we can study effects of chronic stress. And the way that they did this was using this multimodal stress paradigm where the animals were exposed 2 hours every day to multiple different types of stressors. So there was a tactile stressor where the bedding was either wet, covered by wire mesh, or there was no bedding. They would also have an auditory stressor, which was this owl screeching sound, fox and cat urine for an olfactory stressor, and then restraint stress. And so all of these are pretty severe stressors for a mouse, and they were administered chronically across multiple days. And again, this is with Dr. Bale's collaboration. And they found that plasma cell-free mitochondrial DNA was in fact much higher in the mice who had received the stress compared to controls. So they were really interested in seeing whether we see similar patterns in this case, particularly women, we looked at from the Grady Trauma Project. So Dr. Carter and Dr. Stenson really worked on sending plasma samples to the Bale lab. And they identified women from the Grady Trauma Project and African-American women who reported either high or low levels of discrimination. And we found this significant increase that was very similar to what we found in the chronic stress mouse model. And what's really important is that high discrimination had higher levels of cell-free mitochondrial DNA compared to low discrimination, regardless of trauma exposure. So the TEI here is the traumatic events inventory. And you'll see that those with low discrimination, even under high trauma conditions, don't show that increase, whereas the high discrimination group shows that increase even with low other types of trauma. So this does seem to be specific and unique to racism-related stress and discrimination. So very quickly, I just want to show you one other measure that we've collected, really looking at parasympathetic and sympathetic activity, again, related to discrimination. So in my lab, mostly the way we collect data is through psychophysiological methods. And we measure startle response through the eye blink contraction to a loud noise. And we also measure heart rate variability. And then using this measure of experiences of discrimination questionnaire, we identified individuals who either reported discrimination across their lifetime or did not. And comparing that, we found that the startle responses were much higher in those reporting discrimination. On the other hand, heart rate variability was much lower, and this is really a measure of vagal tone. High frequency heart rate variability was decreased, and sympathetic tone was increased. So again, discrimination across all of these measures seems to be indicating higher sympathetic arousal and less parasympathetic activity in those with high discrimination levels. And just to note that all of these relationships remain significant, again, after controlling for SES factors such as income and also trauma load. So quickly, just to summarize, experiencing racial discrimination is a chronic stress, and it does have biological effects. It's associated with altered physiological measures such as higher cell-free mitochondrial DNA, increased startle reactivity, decreased parasympathetic or vagal tone, and increased sympathovagal balance. So we're really seeing alteration in the automatic nervous system with this increased sympathetic and decreased parasympathetic drive. So with that, I want to thank everybody for listening and also thank our funders.
Thank you very much, Dr. Jovanovic. That was really interesting and very informative. We're going to hold our questions for you to the end of this session for the panel discussion, and we'll delve into those then. We'll now move on to our second speaker. It's my pleasure to present to you Dr. Monica Williams, who's an associate professor in the School of Psychology at the University of Ottawa in Ontario, Canada, and a board-certified licensed clinical psychologist specializing in cognitive behavioral therapies. She's a Canada Research Chair in Mental Health Disparities and Director of the Laboratory of Culture and Mental Health Disparities. Dr. Williams' interests include the role of culture and race on mental illness, and she's an authority on racial trauma and one of the very few researchers focused on the inclusion of people of color in psychedelic medicine, which she will be talking to us about today. And she's been working for many years with MAPS, or the Multidisciplinary Association for Psychedelic Studies. Dr. Williams is also very well known for her work with organizations and businesses, where she gives lectures and conducts workshops with the aim of improving the racial climate, improving cultural competence, and ultimately reducing racism in the workplace. Dr. Williams has shared her expertise with many media outlets, including the New York Times and Psychology Today's blog, Culturally Speaking, and is here to share it with us all today. With that being said, we are pleased to have Dr. Williams here to discuss with us the impacts of racial trauma and paths towards healing. Dr. Williams, over to you.
Oh, thank you so much. Thank you so much for that. Yeah, it's a real pleasure to be here today. And we don't have much time, so I'm going to just dive right into it. With the first question we really need to answer is, what is racism? So when we talk about racism, most of us think about what a lot of us term old-fashioned racism, right? So this is also called dominative racism. It's a traditional form of bigotry where it's like, I hate you, you hate me, because of the color of your skin or your ancestry. But there are many other kinds of racism, and in fact, this sort of outward, overt, old-fashioned racism is really only a small part of the problem when we think about racism in society. Other kinds of racism that we talk about and study include symbolic racism. And this is when people embrace negative stereotypes about people of color, or may believe, for example, that they're morally inferior, and they might, frown on people, and they would say, no, it's not because they're in that group, but it's because, of the way they act or their culture. There's something wrong with their culture or their behavior. And we often, we might think of this as like right-wing racism, where people embrace negative stereotypes about different groups of people. On the other side of that, we have aversive racism, which is a kind of racism that supports equality, where people will say that they are progressive and egalitarian, but they may have negative feelings toward people of color that may be conscious or unconscious. But the problem is they still then behave in racist ways, particularly when the norms are ambiguous or nobody's looking over their shoulder. And so often you have outcomes that are not much unlike other forms of racism, where people of color still end up being discriminated, despite despite the fact that perpetrators may profess to be non-discriminatory. And then, and one way that racism is perpetrated is through what we may call microaggressions, which is a subtle form of racism that is very easily deniable, and also introduces a lot of uncertainty into people who may experience it, because they're left wondering, why did that person treat me in that way? Is it racially motivated? And then finally, structural racism is the racism that's sort of baked into all of our institutions and policies that causes racist outcomes even when individuals may not be behaving in discriminatory ways. Now, I'm not going to talk about systemic racism because all racism is systemic by definition. And these are the structures that prop up people when they behave in racist ways that prevents anything from being done about it. So racism is real and systemic. And as far as we can tell by every economic and educational indicator, it's real, it's happening. Sometimes people will say, hey, discrimination against white people's gotten bad too. I'd just say, show me the data, because at this point, we don't have any data that shows that. And I'm not going to go through all this because of our limited time today, but I'll just suffice to say that, look, these numbers are pretty grave. And if you look at, for example, the median household wealth between, say, a Black family and a white family, you're going to see a vast difference. And over the past 25 years, the wealth gap between Blacks and whites has nearly tripled. And the racial gap in who's graduating from college has widened since 2007, with Black and Hispanic people falling further behind in graduation rates. Now, most of you are familiar with the concept of trauma. And when we think about things that traumatize others, we're often thinking about things like combat, assault, and rape, which certainly people of color experience. But people of color may have additional traumatic stressors as well that are often not on the radar of mental health professionals. And these include things like police harassment, search and assault, workplace discrimination, community violence, murder of loved ones, incarceration, and distressing medical and or childbirth experiences. Additionally, immigrants and refugees may be facing additional types of traumas and stressors as well, including things they may have experienced in their countries of origin, which may be the very thing that caused them to flee in the first place, such as experience or witnessing torture, enduring ethnic cleansing and persecution, destruction of cultural practices, living in a war zone, immigration difficulties, and or dealing with the fallout of deportation. And of course, certainly anyone can experience these things, but you know, during in my work at the University of Louisville, where I was the clinical director for the refugee mental health clinic, these were a lot of the things we saw people bringing in as traumatizing. And then on top of that, they were dealing with a culture of stress, which often included more discrimination. So research has shown some pretty profound connections between racism and mental health. And we now have research that's been conducted over the past 20 years that shows some pretty definitive links to just about every type of mental condition that we've studied and the experiences of racism and discrimination. And we know that racism and discrimination are stressful, and we know stress makes any condition worse. And racism and discrimination can contribute to existing disorders or predisposition to existing problems or cause problems in their own right. And we sometimes refer to this as racial trauma. Now, these problems are not unique to the United States. Racism is a global problem. I live in Canada now, and the experience of the Indigenous people in Canada, many have argued is actually like worse than the experience of African Americans in every way that we can tell. And you don't even have to look far to find examples in the media. For example, here's a case where an Indigenous man and his granddaughter were arrested for trying to open a bank account because they brought a large check in to deposit, and the police were called. So these things are happening everywhere, unfortunately. And in fact, racial trauma is everywhere, and social media can even spread racial trauma. And to the point that it impacts the whole world. Even things that are happening in the US can traumatize people in other places. Here's a very unfortunate example, a very real example. Actually, we have here the killing of George Floyd. My niece lives in Germany. She's a college student there. I was very disturbed to get this text message from her when she came across the George Floyd video in the middle of the night, unsuspectingly. She couldn't stop crying because she felt so traumatized by the footage. I encouraged her to write about it. She wrote an article called From a Black College Student in Germany, It's Traumatic, which you can read on Psychology Today. But I'll give you a brief quote from what she wrote. She said that when she saw the video, she said, "How could they do that? How could they do that?" I yell out between the sobs. "Someone is out there thinking that they will see this man again. Someone is waiting for him to come home, and now he's dead. A great sense of injustice grips my heart, and nobody could do anything to stop it. I begin to read everything I can find about what happened, but I know there will be no reasonable answers to my question. There is only one: racism." And she has more to say about that. And so as a psychologist and a researcher, one of the things that I'm interested in are treatments for racial trauma. How do we help people with racial trauma, especially given the fact that, you know, it is all over the world. And one of the modalities I've been studying is psychedelic assisted therapy. And so one of the questions that I've been studying is, can psychedelics heal racial trauma? Now, for those of you who don't know this yet, psychedelic research is happening everywhere. Many top schools have had psychedelic research centers for some time, with new ones emerging, it seems like almost daily. It's at a fever pitch. Johns Hopkins got a $17 million grant to open their center, and many other schools have gotten considerable funds for this. Much of the research is biomedically focused, but a good deal of it is looking at the combination of psychedelics with psychotherapy. And there are a number of different types of substances that are being investigated for a number of different disorders, using several different psychotherapeutic approaches. And because, you know, in our treatment models, one of the things I'm very interested in is how we approach these things and how we train and prepare new clinicians. A lot of what I do is teaching and training aspiring psychologists. And so I think that this is going to really be a new paradigm in mental health care, and we all have to be prepared for it because it is coming. The FDA approved phase 3 trials for MDMA-assisted psychedelic therapy for PTSD, and actually those trials, which were sponsored by MAPS, the Multidisciplinary Association for Psychedelic Studies, those trials actually just finished, and the data was very, very good, and now the FDA is evaluating it. But in addition, there are psychedelic therapy clinics sprouting up now, psychedelic retreat centers. And so there are increasing opportunities for people to find their own psychedelic healing. You can even go to church and get psychedelics. This is a church just up the road from me, more or less, in Montreal, that is with Dr. Jessica Rochester as the founder and madrina, where they do ayahuasca ceremonies. And the ayahuasca is a psychedelic substance containing DMT that is one of their sacraments. And psychedelic assisted therapies have also arrived. Here in Canada, they're being used for end-of-life care to deal with end-of-life anxiety. And in the state of Oregon, they just passed a resolution to allow psychedelics for anything, and psychedelic therapy is coming. So some important questions facing this field are, how will we ensure mental health professionals and others are equipped to do this important work with people of color, especially given that people of color have so much trauma as a result of racism. And so to get a handle on the scope of this problem, our lab did a study looking at all the RCTs done for psychedelic assisted therapy worldwide. And well, this headline in Tonic pretty much says it all. We found that to date, mostly just white people have been a part of these studies, both as patients and researchers. African-American participation was a low 2.5%, and it wasn't much better for any other group that wasn't white. So even though people of color have been left out, some people of color are using psychedelics for healing anyway. Here's some research I did with my collaborator, Alan Davis, where we did a cross-national study in Canada and the US and surveyed people of color who said that they had used psychedelics to cope with a difficult experience surrounding racism. And I don't have time to go into the details of our analysis. For those of you who are nerds and geeks like myself, here's a pretty picture. But the long and short of it is that we asked people about their symptoms before and after this memorable psychedelic event, and people's symptoms decreased. Symptoms of trauma, of depression, of stress and anxiety decreased after their memorable psychedelic experience with a fairly decent effect size. And so all this to say, psychedelics may hold some promise in helping decrease the negative impact of racial trauma. And I think now with this data, we can make a strong case that future clinical trials need to examine the efficacy of psychedelics with psychotherapy for people with racial trauma. And some of the other work we've been doing in this area includes a study where women of color, in this case 3 Black women therapists, described their experiences with MDMA as part of a research study, an approved research study, where they received it under the same conditions that participants would, and their observations about what we can do to expand health equity around psychedelics and people of color. And so this is the first account in the academic literature that we know of that's focused on the psychedelic experiences of Black women, which also led me to write this article where we talk about why Black people should embrace psychedelic healing, and in fact, reclaiming our cultural birthright, as psychedelics have actually been a part of human healing for thousands of years. And I was also able to get a grant for $70,000 from the Open Society Foundation to do a workshop on cultural trauma and which was unprecedented, because we were able to train the largest cohort ever of therapists of color, MDMA therapists of color, which was 50. Future research that we're in the planning stages of now includes expanded access or compassionate use of MDMA for PTSD in people of color at my clinic in Connecticut, and that is just getting started now. And we're in the planning stages of a study of MDMA for refugees here in Canada, and a study of psilocybin microdosing for racial trauma as well, if we can get our IRB to actually understand what that is. So anyway, I'm continuing to move ahead with this important work, and there's little to no government funding for it. So please reach out to me if you'd like to help support the work of our lab. Here's some resources for those of you who would like to learn more about working effectively with people of color, and thank you.
Thank you, Dr. Williams, and good afternoon, everyone. My name is Joe Simon, as I have mentioned earlier, and I will be moderating today's Q&A session. So just to let you guys all know, we've had a number of questions that have come in, and since our limited time schedule, we might not be able to get to everyone, and we do apologize for that. So the first question will be to Dr. Jovanik. Does your data indicate that there are potential sex differences in discrimination between men and women? And how might men and women respond differently to this discrimination at the biological level?
Thank you, Joe. Yeah, so the measure that we use to capture racial discrimination actually asks about experiences of discrimination in different settings. So, for example, in a healthcare setting, getting access to healthcare, talking to doctors, in a service setting, purchasing something in a store, getting food from a restaurant. And then it also has, in a law enforcement or police setting. And we do find that women experience racism much more in service settings, and men experience racism much more in these police-related or law enforcement settings. And that is something I think that we've seen in the media as well. And we specifically in our studies have looked at women. So in both the cell-free mitochondrial DNA study and in the startle studies, we focused primarily on females. And we found that both the sympathetic reactivity and the increased cell-free mitochondrial DNA in women was related to these experiences of racism in the service setting. So we have to really look a little bit more closely at men. In all of our studies, we actually have more women than men. And that is something that we're going to look at more in the future. We did see also that even in children, we see sex differences. So maternal discrimination decreases heart rate variability in their daughters, but not their sons. So we see that there may be something about that sex difference that's perpetuated across generations, where parental racism and experiences of discrimination are impacting the biology and the physiology of their offspring, also in a sex-specific manner.
Okay, okay. Yes, I have a second question here also for Dr. Jovanik. Regarding the enhanced systematic activity and reduced vagal tone, both of which are associated with negative cardiovascular outcomes, do you have any comments on whether this has also been associated with facing high discrimination?
Yeah, that's an excellent question, because we do know that the prevalence of cardiovascular disease, hypertension, and just like Dr. Williams also showed, is much higher in Black Americans compared to white Americans. But I don't know that we've specifically linked that, and Monica might know more about this, to experiences of discrimination. But we definitely know that there are very prevalent health disparities, and getting to the bottom of that and how racism does affect those disparities, I think, is very critical.
Okay. I wanted to ask Dr. Williams a question here. So you talked about the effects of racial trauma. Knowing this, do you have any advice for people who might be trying to cope with or even combat racial trauma in their environment?
Yeah, it's a good question. I mean, it kind of depends on how traumatized you are, because I think some basic coping skills can be really helpful for just sort of daily racism. And these could include things like self-care and taking a little time to step away from the source of the racism, talking to people who are sympathetic and understand and who can be supportive, and spiritual practices, if you're a spiritual person, can be very helpful and grounding as well. However, if the traumatization is to the point where the person's having trouble functioning in daily life, I think that professional help might be needed, and it would be really important to find a clinician who really understands racial trauma, who can help the person make some life changes around their environment, and also be a source of sort of support and an assistance to them, because sometimes your environment is so traumatic that you have to make an escape plan, and which is unfortunate, but sometimes that's what's required.
Okay. Actually, as a follow-up to that, do you believe that racial trauma can truly be healed at the personal level? I mean, given, recent events like, riots at the Capitol and whatnot, and like how we have our personal environment is disrupted, and we have to go back into that. I guess what I'm asking is, can we heal if we're still living in the same type of environment that resulted in the trauma in the first place?
Yeah, that's a really good question, because generally, as a clinician, when you help somebody who's been traumatized, you really want them to be out of that traumatic situation so they have the space to heal. And unfortunately for people of color in America, you don't really get space to heal because it's just everywhere. So, so certainly if you're in a situation like, let's say, a workplace situation where you have a very abusive boss, you would really need to get out of that in order to heal. But I do think people can find healing. I mean, some of this is maybe just like a matter of faith for me, because we don't really have the research yet that shows how people, the best way to bring about healing from racial trauma and then long-term outcomes. Like, that just doesn't even exist yet. That's how far behind we are in studying this. But I do think people can get better, and I see them get better. And sometimes you have to, but it does usually require making some big changes to your life, and big changes are always hard.
That is true. That is true.
Okay, thank you, Dr. Williams. So we're trying to merge all the questions we're getting to get at the moment and kind of fit them in with the two talks. So this question is actually to both speakers, and it's from a colleague of ours, Sherrod Haynes. How do you foresee racism fitting into the traditional biomedical model of disease? You've provided compelling data on the impact of racism on an array of biological variables that have the potential to impact one's health, accumulate, and potentially be passed intergenerationally. And I know, Tanya, you've done some work on intergenerational trauma. So do you believe that the evidence here could be used to classify racism as a pathology in itself, with the search for druggable targets maybe? Similarly, how do you think of other mental disorders? And either of you can go first and attempt to answer that.
Yeah, well, I mean, I'll jump in and say, I do think that racism, I do think that it causes psychopathology. I think it's very real psychopathology. And I know some people have said we shouldn't pathologize, we shouldn't pathologize it because it's a normal reaction to an abnormal ongoing stressor, which I agree with. But at the same time, when I see someone with racial trauma, they look exactly like someone with PTSD, and that's how I'm going to treat them. I'm going to give them a treatment that is going to work for that. So I think it's a real thing. I conceptualize it as a traumatic stressor, although certainly it can come out in many different ways. I've seen people, who were prone to paranoia become very paranoid because of racism, or who were prone to shyness become socially phobic because of racism. So it doesn't necessarily have to be PTSD, but that's where most of the work has been done. And I'll let Tanya answer the rest of that question.
Yeah, I absolutely agree that this is, what we see, it looks very much like illness. And so, in fact, what we're seeing is that racism above and beyond other types of trauma exposure or chronic stressor impacts biology. So it may be that it has its own unique profile of both biological and psychological consequences. And so an answer to the question is whether or not we should treat it as its own illness. I do think, it's going to have a lot of transdiagnostic qualities with PTSD symptoms, anxiety, depression. But I don't know, maybe there's a time when that will be the target. And it sounds to me like potentially having that as a druggable target, something that is a chronic stressor, may look different than other types of trauma or stress. So it may in fact be something that we could specifically and uniquely target.
So in relation to the some of the biomarkers you mentioned, Tanya, like the cell-free mitochondrial DNA, and I guess Dr. Williams, you can weigh in on this too, but for example, would psychedelic therapy reverse some of these markers? Is there any evidence of, post-therapy, these markers are reduced at all?
Well, it's still really early to look at that, but I mean, I know actually that research is being done, that this data is being collected, but we don't have the answers yet. I think that you would see a reversal, but again, I'm going to defer to Tanya for that one.
So I don't know, again, it's early days and we're just now looking at these, especially the cell-free mitochondrial DNA as a biomarker related to racism, just even as a first line observation rather than as a treatment marker. I will say one of the things, that we did find, the sympathetic reactivity and the startle response, we are using that in a trial. As Dr. Williams said, psychedelic research is everywhere. So we also are involved in with a group at Emory with Dr. Rothbaum and Dr. Norholm, where we've been looking at MDMA effects on fear conditioning and extinction using startle responses. And we did find that, and this was in just healthy controls, so we don't know yet what would happen in a traumatized sample or in a sample with high levels of racial discrimination. But we are seeing that MDMA does in fact have treatment effects on some of these psychophysiological measures. So I anticipate that in the future, we will be able to assess whether psychedelics could reverse some of this damage, either at the cellular level or on maybe the sympathetic nervous system.
Okay. we're actually getting a couple of questions about the other half of this racial problem, besides, how it affects, people of color and whatnot, but the actual aggressors. Do you guys have any input on like ways that can be, looked at from the research standpoint, or how to, find these type of individuals and, maybe even get them some, therapy to help with their issues that they're having?
Yeah, no, I think that's a great question, because it's really easy to put a lot of emphasis on helping and fixing people who've been damaged by racism, but really what you want to do is stop the racism. And a big part of that is going to be looking for the source of the racism and making changes. And so I do think that I do think that this is an important area that needs a lot of attention. Unfortunately, the way our society works, people are very, very reluctant to call out other people on their racism. And until we are willing to do that, all of us, people of color and white people together, point out racism and say it's not okay, it's going to keep happening. And part of that is the way people are socialized, particularly in white families. There's very little emphasis or practice in even talking about race. And so people aren't good at it. They feel uncomfortable doing it, and then they end up not doing it, even when they want to. And that keeps the problem going.
I agree. And so I think a good question to follow up from that is, how do you both, in an ideal world, what does the mental health field look like for you in 10 years' time? Considering psychedelic therapy, considering targeting the aggressors and the people who've, been targeted and affected by this. But in an ideal world, what does the mental health field look like for you in 10 years?
Yeah, well, I'll jump in and say, number one, as someone who's very interested in mental health disparities, we have to make some huge changes to the mental healthcare workforce. It's almost entirely white. And I think that every person who wants mental health care has a right to see somebody in their own ethnic group if that's what they want. And right now we can't do that. We can't meet that demand. And so I think that's the first thing that has to change. And then secondly, I think we all need to do our own anti-racism work so that we can be effective when we're working with people from different groups. And we know that there's a huge training gap and there's a huge need around that. And so, so I would say those are, for me, the two biggest targets. Yeah.
And Tanya, what about for you? What do you see it looking like?
Well, I of course see adding to that, yeah, I agree with all of those points, but adding an understanding of mechanism. So what is happening at the biological level, at the brain level? Can we target that? And I'm also really interested in preventing some of these intergenerational effects. So if we can also better understand how some of these factors are inherited, both psychologically and biologically, can we prevent this vicious cycle from continuing into multiple generations in the future? And I think biology really offers, a lot to both understand and then to better be able to track these changes and whether or not treatments can reverse these changes.
Thank you very much, both of you. Those were really great answers. And just before we close, I can't believe how quickly this hour's gone. But before we close, just so we have some actionable recommendations that we can take forwards from this. And I guess, Dr. Williams, given your work with organizations and businesses to improve the racial climate, what are the key recommendations that you would give to help protect our Black colleagues' mental health from the effects of anti-Black racism? What would you recommend we campaign for? For example, an anonymous reporting system where people can report microaggressions or more overt racism, and that way it will raise institutional awareness. What recommendations do you have?
Yeah, so unfortunately, when people of color report racism and discrimination in the workplace to HR or whoever, often they are met either it's ignored or they're retaliated against or they're fired. So the first thing that has to happen is we need to change the way this works for HR. And I think that there needs to be some transparency and accountability for every complaint that comes in, along with satisfaction metrics of those who've made the complaints. And there has to be follow-up to make sure that every person who files a complaint is satisfied with the result. And that's got to be our target. And so I think when that happens, we'll start to see change in the workplace. But right now, because these agencies are really just devised to sort of like cover your butt for organizations, right now they do nothing but protect the organizations. And that has to change first.
All right, and with that, we will have to wrap up today's session. That was very fast, like Aya said. What's it called? A big thank you to Dr. Jovanik and Williams for their time and willingness to participate in this discussion. We also like to thank Dr. Nestler, Gary Butts, and Angel Palermo for the funding and space to make this very important discussion possible. We'd also like to thank Veronica and the Digital Media Center for the admin support and promotion of this event. Couldn't do it without you guys. And a big thank you to Aya for getting this ball rolling, putting this all together, and having us all here. That was very important. And finally, we'd like to thank you, the audience, for spending this past hour with us. We hope you found it informative, and we'll be advertising our next session where we'll be discussing the intergenerational effects of racial stress. And with that, be safe and have a good rest of your afternoon.
Thank you, everyone.